Okay, hello, and welcome to this eCampus news webinar, New STEM Strategies for Post-Pandemic Campuses. My name is Kevin Hogan. I am the editor-at-large for eCampus, and I'm excited to have you join us for what should be a very informative session. Today's event is brought to you by Digital Ed. Digital Ed is an online learning company with a simple and resonant purpose: to shape the world through digital learning. The Mobius platform is one of the most innovative and comprehensive platforms for STEM education, providing lessons, assessments, and interactive learning activities, and it allows STEM students to acquire a knowledge at a guided yet self-defined pace. For students, Mobius provides an interactive digital learning environment that can be accessed anytime, anywhere, providing immediate automatic marking and sophisticated student feedback. Before we get into our conversation, I'd like to take a minute to go over some of the features of the platform that we're using for this webinar. Today's event will be recorded, so you don't have to worry about missing a thing. Within a few days, you'll receive an email message that contains a link to the recorded webinar, along with a PDF of the slides. You can submit questions at any time during the presentation by clicking on the Q&A box. There will also be a chat. There will also be a time at the end of the presentation for our speakers to address questions. I also encourage you, though, like during the conversation, that you can throw questions at the panelists and myself at any time if you have something of particular import at that time. Also, there is a chat function that you can launch by clicking on chat. Feel free to use this feature to contact someone from the eCampus news team if you have a technical question, but please don't use that to ask questions of speakers. Closed captioning is also available by clicking on the CC tab. So with these housekeeping items out of the way, let's get started with our conversation, and would like to introduce our panel. First, Dr. Joel Hadley. Joel is a lecturer in mathematical sciences at the University of Liverpool and leads the Mathematics Center for Enhancement in Education. In 2018, he was awarded a Learning and Technology Fellowship at the university in recognition of his development and distribution of automated assessment activities within the Department of Mathematical Sciences, with a view to the enhancement of the student experience. Also with us today, Louise Krumpadek. Louise is the Vice President of Educational Enterprise in Enterprise Services and Digital Ed. Louise is an expert in online learning with a math and educational background, as well as over 20 years experience in education technology, specializing in STEM subjects. She's been a member of several committees and panels on best practices in using technology in education, as well as curriculum design, and she has presented at numerous conferences. Louise earned her Master's of Mathematics and Bachelor of Mathematics from the University of Waterloo. She also holds a Bachelor of Education from Althouse College, the Faculty of Education at the University of Western Ontario. Joel and Louise, thank you so much for taking your time today to join me for this conversation. I'm really looking forward to it.
Thanks, Kevin. Glad to be here.
Yeah, me too.
And unfortunately, we do need to continue to talk about the topic, which I know we're all tired of talking about, which is operating education institutions and putting together curriculums and teaching students in the time of COVID. As desperate as we are to move forward, we're still in a situation where a lot of the technologies and techniques that had been in place for several years when it comes to the use of remote learning and remote teaching, really we saw obviously the acceleration of that. Joel, maybe you can start us off and talk a little bit about your work with specifically STEM subjects and the use of remote learning, BP, before a pandemic, as I like to talk about it, and then maybe give us some of your experiences starting in, I'm guessing around March of 2020 when all hell broke loose.
Sure. So when all hell broke loose, obviously we had very little time to prepare ourselves for remote teaching. But then we had a whole summer to think about it and plan. And one of the things one of my mantras about everything that's happened is the pandemic was a driver for innovation, but much more, it was a driver for adoption. And we were in quite a good place to handle the switch to remote teaching because we already had some emerging innovation of flipping classrooms, some online delivery, and really importantly, automated assessment, which was been really critical for this rapid switch.
Yeah. And, and also as we get started with the conversations, we do have a few questions for the audience as well that go along with their experiences during this time. Chris, maybe if you could launch the first of the three questions that we have. So the first question is, how did your institution go back to school this fall? Still an open-ended question, especially from the international perspective, depending on where you are on the planet, how effective the vaccination rates have been, other political aspects involving that. So give us your choice. Has it been online only, face-to-face, blended and hybrid, or other? Joel, what was your circumstances for this fall? Had you gotten through and back to normal, or was it still sort of a hybrid situation?
Well, we're not back to normal. We're hybrid, but I know that there's a significant number of my colleagues are never going back to the way we were. So people are going to the enhanced normal. So normal, but supported by all the things we've learned. Right.
And it looks like your description certainly goes along with the results that we got here with 73% blended hybrid. So that's a pretty confirming statistic. Thank you, Chris. If you could launch question number 2. So for the audience, what would you consider the biggest obstacle for faculty when going online? This probably could be a much longer list from my conversations in the past few months, but is it a lack of content for STEM? Is it STEM courses that can't be transferred online? A need for support from the institution in developing or delivering online courses? Faculty not trained? Faculty preferring face-to-face? A difficulty possibly for conducting hands-on labs? Or an inability to ensure academic integrity? Louise, I would suspect we could also have put in an option there for all of the above, right? Well, what have your experiences been there in terms of obstacles you see with your customers?
Yeah, definitely. I would say you sort of all of the above definitely fits. I think here, looking at the range from one institution to the next, there's usually sort of a predominant one that they are feeling. But definitely, looking at how do we move things online at the beginning of the pandemic, that was a big struggle. And then into, okay, we've moved things online, but what does it mean to be online? What makes a truly effective course online became, after, like as Joel said, through the summer where you're thinking about for the fall, what do we do? And the idea of academic integrity has been a big issue, and thinking of how do you make sure that the students are learning what they need to learn, and that they're providing that reference, that information of what they have learned.
That's really interesting, and as you can see from the results, that reflects what you were saying too, Louise, especially that that idea of academic integrity. I mean, I really do think that is one of those disconnects, that while there are so many advantages to these platforms, there's something about the in-person that really kind of accentuates that idea of integrity, and what you're doing really works, right? So thank you, Chris, for the results for number 2. And I guess we have one more question to pull up to ask the audience. So what are some of the biggest challenges for students when they face going online? Technical issues, lack of motivation. I know my 3 beta testers here at home, that was certainly a big issue, having the motivation to do work, especially math online. The choice of students do not have the opportunity to learn through hands-on experiences. Students facing the social aspects of learning in terms of class and group work, and then students not having any challenges when going online. Joel, I know that I think sometimes professionals and adults make presumptions that we have a generation of students who are digital natives, and that these platforms are second nature. But is that really fair to them? Do you see that the challenges that we're looking at here are something that they're still trying to learn how to deal with?
Yeah, so a big problem we faced, and it was faced across the sector, at least in the UK and the things I've attended, is getting students to engage with each other through online platforms was really challenging. And our prototypical model of the flipped classroom, with what we call the active learning sessions, where students work collaboratively on problems, we had the idea that would translate nicely to Zoom.
Yeah.
And it didn't, because it was just difficult to get students to engage with each other. And I would say for me, it was probably the social aspects of learning were the most difficult to replicate. And I think it's because if you meet someone in the corridor, that just happens. With online, you have to make a specific effort to do anything. Nothing just happens.
Yeah, and as we look at the results here, Louise, does that resonate with your experience too, with other customers for Mobius?
Yes, I think, one of the big things that we often hear is, the worry that an online course will not be as effective as an in-person course. And a big piece of that is the motivation of the students. When they're in person looking at the instructor, or when the instructor is engaging with them, or they're engaging with other students, there's that engagement level that helps with the motivation. Some students don't have that intrinsic motivation, and they need those extrinsic forces in order to really get involved in the course. And I think that we've seen that, and now some of the things that we're looking at, this last year has definitely developed, the technology has developed the way that we think about online education. And now it's a matter of looking at, okay, so what can we do to help with those? Increase things like sort of inline exercises that students can test themselves to see, do they understand as they're going? Additional interactive activities so that they can feel like they're more immersed in the course. And some of those types of things that we can start to implement more.
Now, Joel, in the bio and reading in your introduction, you were being recognized for your work in this space in 2018. So, and I know, as prescient as you are, I'll assume a global pandemic was not one of the aspects that you thought you would have to deal with when it comes to putting together these sorts of curriculum. What has that experience done to change the way which you might have thought about some of these things pre-pandemic?
Okay, that's a tough question, isn't it? I guess I go back to what I said before and said it's the pandemic drove adoption. So I think the rationale for introducing the digital assessment hasn't really changed. I think people are just a bit more comfortable with it on the staff side, a bit more comfortable to adopt it now that they've used it, and the students are perhaps a bit more comfortable to trust it now that they've used it so much.
So it's really the biggest change is in the human behavior, not necessarily the technology involved.
Yeah, I guess so. I think people are more willing to try and give things a go and then be a bit more comfortable with them, since being forced to do it for 18 months.
Yeah. Does that resonate with you, Louise? I mean, are there things that some innovations that may have taken place either on the user behavior side or on the technology side as we kind of went through this time?
Definitely. Like, I think before the pandemic, you had sort of the innovators who were already looking at the digital tools and how do we use this functionality, this technology in the classroom. And then there was still sort of the holdouts who liked the traditional face-to-face, and that's all they were ever going to do. And I think the pandemic really forced everyone to look at, wait a minute, what do we do? And as people had to move things online, they realized they could move things online, and then looked at, now it's time to look at, okay, so what does it mean? How do we now proceed from here? One of the big conversations that I've been involved with recently is just around assessment. And is the traditional assessment of, here's a quiz, here are 7 questions, answer these questions and get a grade, is that the right way to grade and to assess student learning? And that's a big conversation now that may not have happened, without the pandemic really forcing people into the online assessment side.
Yeah, as I've said many times, it's almost like this is the greatest beta test in history, right? In terms of the use of these technologies. I love this. Straight away, we're getting some questions from the audience. One came in asking, Joel, was the lack of student engagement a general conclusion across all students, or were there certain demographic slices, either by gender, age, socioeconomics, or other, where you saw a higher or lower engagement from learning online?
Probably not a very insightful answer, I'm afraid. I didn't notice any difference for any particular demographic.
That's interesting. Okay. And Louise, how about from your work with your customers? Were there any? I know that that's certainly a big question when it comes to digital equity, in the terms of the equal access to the technology, that even while some communities received the bandwidth and the technology to have it, if students had a lack, and maybe now this is for the younger demographic, I mean, college age students probably wouldn't be relying on guardians or other sort of people in-house, but talk a little bit about that. I mean, were there any noticeable differences in those sectors for you?
Yeah, looking at the research that's been done, there has been a significant sort of drop off in sort of Black, Latino, college age students who have been forced by the pandemic to maybe refocus where their attention has been, and they seem to have been sort of one of the first groups that really got affected and had to maybe put their education on hold because they had to focus on other aspects. So we have seen that. One of the things that we talk to our customers about is providing access to the platform means that even if people have to miss a lecture or two, the material is still there for them. So they're not behind. They can still catch up. They can still review the material when they have the time to do so. And so I think the technology, similar to the discussion about accessibility pieces a number of years ago, where people were like, well, accessibility is only for the people who need it. Now people realize that those accessibility pieces actually help everybody. It's not just for a particular group. And I think the same thing with some of the features and functionality in the technology, making it available to everybody when they need it and when they can spend the time on it.
Interesting. Yeah, a response coming in from the audience. One of the strategies that one of the participants used to mitigate this problem of when it came to engagement was to include pre-class and post-class networking opportunities for the students, so that it was their way of stimulating the equivalent of what you would call hallway talk without having necessarily the instructor monitoring the chats. Joel, is that something that you found to be effective?
Yeah, so we didn't do anything like that, but we did have breakout rooms in some of our sessions, and it was quite hit and miss whether they were used. So some people had good experiences, but a lot of people, the students, were reluctant to turn the cameras on and participate. And as I understand, that's quite common across the sector.
How about the use of other synchronous platforms while it being in the midst of one of the programs? Where you talk about maybe is there a Slack back channel, maybe or a Twitter back channel? Is that something that you found occurring, and was that a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, I understand that our students interacted a lot with each other on channels that we didn't control. So the social elements were there, but the students were managing them, and that's the way it should be, really. I guess I think my students don't want me in the social chat.
Right. And Louise, is that something that is intentional to have those separate platforms in order for the kids to communicate, or students to communicate, versus being within the platform? Is that?
I think no matter what you do, you will always have students using alternate methods, right? So, you know, if they're in person, they're going to have a conversation after class and talk about either the class or, you know, what they've done or what they were doing on the weekend. And there's a difference between your learning platform and then the ability of the students to connect. There are times when they're important to be in sync, but there are times when that connection is outside of the individual learning of a particular class.
Right, right. Let's talk a little bit about the distinctions when it comes to STEM versus other subjects. Joel, I know that we've talked before as we were preparing for this, that well, I use the phrase "show your work," right? But there are certain aspects of when you're talking about math or other STEM subjects that make it different than if you were just teaching a history or English course. Can you kind of break those down a little bit?
Sure. So not every question in maths is objectively correct or incorrect when you say the answer, but some are. And those things are important because unless you know how to do a method, you'll never understand the deep theory behind the method. And quite often those methods are the threshold learning standards. So we have to evaluate whether students have attained them. And that's quite a problem with fully remote education, because if you have an assessment where you ask something where a student has to apply a method or think more clearly, deeply about a method, maybe it's in a context, maybe you're asking for some reflection, what that does is it raises the difficulty level. So it might push out some students who have just attained the threshold, who should be able to get those marks by raising that level. On the other hand, if you have something that's very objectively marked, it's very difficult to rule out that someone else isn't doing it for the student. I think the vast majority of students are honest. So it's the honest students who are most disadvantaged by the minority who are trying to get around these things.
Yeah, I would add, Joel, too, that when you think of STEM subjects, there is that whole piece of show your work or show a proof or explain. That's super important to really understand the student's level. But even just sort of the basic objective type measures, most platforms that are out there, like you need a platform that allows you to do algorithmic parameters and algorithmic questions so that different students are getting different values and are then working on them. And one of the things that does is, even if students want to talk about a question, they have to talk about the mathematics. They can't just say, what's the answer? So you're getting them to have that conversation about math. And one of the other key things when you're looking at STEM subjects is the ability to grade on math equivalence. And so, you know, Joel used the example the other day of, you know, a system needs to be able to know that x over 4 is the same as 0.25 times x. And you know, there are a number of systems out there that aren't designed for STEM, and so they look at them in terms of what are the characters, not what is the mathematical understanding and meaning behind them.
And one of the things that Louise mentioned was really my light bulb moment with digital assessment. You know, I thought we were implementing something that would save us time, that would add some efficiency. But then when I was in a computer room and students were working on their answer, the students said exactly that. They didn't say what's the answer, they said what's the method. And whereas students might very quickly give another student the answer, get the submit and get the tick, they were explaining how to invert a matrix to each other. So it's just it's a nudge in the right direction.
That's interesting. Yeah. So talk a little bit about the tools in Mobius, Louise, that would kind of enable that sort of interaction.
So in Mobius, you have the ability to have sort of these randomized questions, and with the randomized questions, you can change the numbers, like most systems that, you know, if they have an algorithmic capability, you can change the numbers, but you also have the ability to do groups of questions or to do lists within your randomization so that you can have specific cases that maybe you want the students to get into and to interact with. We have a math engine built into the platform, which really enables us to do that math grading for mathematical equivalency. And not only that, but also grading for particular forms. And that's another key thing. As students are learning, you might want them to put their answer in a specific form because it's sort of like those building blocks of language. You know, here's a particular form. Now here's the next form. When you're up in second or third year, you want to solve the problem, and the instructor doesn't care as much if you do the exact form from the very beginning. But at the beginning, you need to learn those individual pieces and building blocks so that you can move forward in your career. And Mobius includes all of those, as well as sort of visualization capabilities so that students have the ability to better understand and get a more concrete understanding of the mathematical expressions that they're interacting with.
And the randomization in Mobius is incredibly powerful because of the Maple engine. So it's not just a case of choose a number between 1 and 10, because you could easily do that just with a question bank with 10 items. We use Mobius in a statistics class, and we add a lot of authenticity to the assessment by generating using the normal random variable in Maple. So students will get hundreds of observations in a random sample that they can do stats on.
Let's go back and talk a little bit about kind of the day-to-day usage, and specifically the dynamics of the synchronous communication with the students remotely versus asynchronous. Can you kind of give us, Joel, a day in the life and how your lectures are going versus office hours versus assignments being brought in and assessed?
Yeah, so we don't have lectures anymore, at least not in the traditional sense. All of our material is delivered asynchronously now, under the handle. Next semester, it's going to be a bit of a mixture. Some people going back to traditional, some hybrid, and some in the middle. But at the moment, everything's hybrid. And what we did is we polled our students to see what they liked in videos. And the videos that we provide now are typically content-driven rather than time-driven. So instead of, I've got 3 hours, what do I put in those 3 hours? It's, this week, the student's learning this material. So how do I best structure these videos for learning? You also mentioned office hours. So one of the things our students really fed back was to keep remote office hours as an option, because an office hour conversation might be 10 minutes, might be 30 minutes, but a student might be traveling 40 minutes for that meeting and then 40 minutes back. So it's very inclusive practice to keep some office hours online. So we are aiming to do that. So you mentioned assessment. So we've done something quite interesting in Liverpool with assessment. So previously, quite a lot of our assessment was loaded towards the end of the semester. So 80, 90, 100% exams. And what that did is it encouraged students to binge learn at the end. So the assessment's coming up, let's cram everything in now. That's not a great idea in general, but especially during a pandemic when that whole week might have to be cancelled. Putting all of the assessments then isn't good. So we made a decision that no final is worth more than 50%. And another thing we did what was interesting is we used to have regular weekly summative assessment, so maybe worth 1%, adding up to 10% with a 90 final. Now all of we have no assessment worth less than 10%. So that means that students aim for quality all the time. They aim for understanding during the semester, And then once that's developed and so on, we have the maybe slightly harder stuff for marks above the threshold at the end. So that's implemented because of a pandemic requirement, but the underlying pedagogy is good. So it's something that we're keeping.
Yeah, and we've seen the same thing in North America, where a lot of schools are sort of doing what they're calling a high flex model, where it's not sort of defined when the student has to be in person or when they have to be remote. They can kind of pick and choose because the content is there remotely available for them, but then there are still going to be either lecture times or office hours on campus that the student can go to. And so this really seems to be a model that people are kind of leaning towards. And some of the students that I've talked to, they really appreciate that flexibility of being able to, to make sure that they still get the material, but in their time. And I think too, Joel, the idea of the assessment, we're seeing that a little bit here in North America as well, where, rather than just one final that's worth a lot, or a final and a midterm, spacing that out and giving students the time to take an assessment and maybe take it multiple times, because really you want them to work on the knowledge, and the practice is part of that. And so allowing them to take assignments multiple times to get to a point where they feel that they understand the material is really important.
And we've got an assignment like that in one of our first year modules. So I want to mention one of my colleagues, Jessica Banks, who's done a lot of innovative things with Mobius. One of the things she's done is exactly what you said, some Mobius mastery assignments. So this is about bringing all students to a common minimal ground. And the mastery assignment, so if a student gets a question wrong, well, they have to get it right. So they get another question to support them. It's a very adaptive, personalized system.
Oh, that's what I was going to say. This is reminding me of some concepts that I would hear a lot about BP before the pandemic: personalized learning and formative assessment. And it sounds like both those concepts are now actually being put to application. Louise, I guess I'll ask you, does it sound about right?
Yes, definitely. We see people looking at different ways to assess students, different ways of approaching the idea of assessment and how to help the students along the path. University of Waterloo, they have created a course for students before they come into class the first time to help them get up to that sort of level of that they're expecting. And so one of the things during the pandemic that's been a concern is, how do you know at the end of the high school that their level of knowledge is where the university expects it to be? And that's another sort of big concern. And so the University of Waterloo has used Mobius, has provided access to a course for students so that they can check themselves and make sure that they understand those concepts, so that when they go into that first couple of weeks of university, they're not worried about, oh, I don't understand all this material, because they've had a chance to learn that. So that's definitely one of the things that the university is doing. And the other thing that we see people do is some of these adaptive tests, like Joel was mentioning, and a really interesting use case again is an escape room. So trying to get students to work together. And so what they've done is they've used a Mobius adaptive assignment where they've created problems that the students have to work on, and they have to solve these problems to get to the next step and the next step, so that they finally kind of escape the room or the scenario that they've been put into. So definitely different ways to let students work on problems.
Yeah.
And we're going to have to rethink these labels, because formative and summative assessment are now very much mixed.
That's very true. That's very true. Let's switch gears a little bit. We've talked a lot about the students and the effect on students. Let's talk about faculty. Let's talk about the professors a little bit and their adaptation, their adoption, and maybe their need to adapt to these new types of ways of teaching. I don't want to stereotype anyone, but when you think about the paper chase and you think about that's the way we've always done it, I imagine a lot of my old university professors who have taught something the way they've done for 35 years, and nothing is going to change that except a global pandemic, right? Joel, talk a little bit about how you saw your colleagues making the move to remote teaching.
With a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of adaptability. I know what you're saying about people being very comfortable in the way they've always done things, but I think even the people who I would have imagined would be like that were not. Everyone adapted, and in different ways. So I convinced my faculty to buy everyone a tablet PC as we were going into the pandemic year. And these have been really well used in really nice ways. But some colleagues stuck to writing on the board and buying cameras to film it. Either way, the students were getting the learning experience.
That's great to hear. That's great to hear. I mean, especially during the time that the people rose up to the challenges that they were having. But again, as you say, about I know that there was always a lot of resistance when it comes to recording lectures and things like that, and people being uncomfortable using Zoom. Louise, talk about what your experience is there in terms of professional development for faculty before the pandemic. And I'm assuming that's just something else that needed to be accelerated exponentially starting in March of last year.
Yeah, I think it was interesting. We did see, a lot of people who were willing to kind of pick it up and try, and work and really try to move their courses online quickly. But the other thing that I saw that was really heartwarming was the number of institutions that shared their best practices with everybody else. And so they have set parts on their website now that are like, here's how you take a course online, or here are some best practices in teaching online, or here's some content that we have used. And I found that, people were willing to come together to really help each other. The other thing that we noticed, obviously, we provide this platform, but we also know, content was super important for instructors. If they had to move online with basically recreating everything from scratch, that was a much bigger issue for them. Than we have some content packs available in the platform that they could use as a starting point, so they can start working on something. And with Mobius, instructors are able to add things as the term progresses. So it really is this sort of live course that you're working on and making updates to and improving as you go through the course.
Now, Joe, let's talk a little bit more about the user experience, not only for the faculty, but the students as well, in terms of other systems that they might be using on the day-to-day basis. Are there ways in which Mobius is intertwined, or their particular subject matters intertwined versus other aspects of their university experience?
So our VLE, what you'd probably call an LMS, is Canvas. And Mobius integrates very well with Canvas. What we've learned over the years is that it's helpful to have a consistent approach to settings. So we have a central Mobius team who makes sure that all the integrations are done in the same or similar way. Even if the pedagogy and the implementation are different, students access them in the same way. The other thing we decided, and this was to build trust in the platform, is we give students a route to claim that their correct answer has been marked wrong but should be marked correct. Because Mobius is really powerful, but you can't predict absolutely everything someone's going to do wrong. And this just lets students know there's a human behind this. This is they're not being assessed by a robot, they're being assessed by a human with a robot. And it just builds confidence in the platform.
Well, that really speaks to going back to the poll, we're talking about the idea of the academic integrity, right, Louise?
Yeah, academic integrity, like that's a really tough one, and it is a key point in today's world, right? When, if we think back 20 years ago, when students were working on an assignment, they were either working on a lab at the university, so it was very controlled. But when you think about today, they're remote, they're on a laptop, they have a phone, they might have a tablet. So how do you limit what they're actually using and how they're getting information? And so you have to really think about how do you design your assessments around that. It's definitely a big question, and I don't think we have solved it in any way of saying it. It's something that we're still working on, and we have to think about how do we approach it.
Yeah, Joel, because you were talking about students, working together and helping each other, but there's a fine line between collaboration and cheating, right?
That there is. One of the things we implemented in a module is we had a group project. So one chapter of the module was self-taught in groups, and every student got their own Mobius assignment linked to the group project. And that worked well, because then we're not penalizing students for working together. We're rewarding them for working together, because that's how research works. Anyway, so I'm not saying that's a universal solution. I don't think there is a universal solution, but I think what we've got in our toolkit are lots of small things that can help in different contexts.
Mm.
Yeah, and I would say Mobius is very flexible in terms of, different things that you can do and different approaches that you can take and different settings that you can do to help with however the institution decides they want to approach their learning.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about some security aspects of it. I mean, in terms of the integrity of the data as it's going in. Joel, have you had any challenges when it comes to that? I mean, in terms of the collecting of the information, the assessment, and the student privacy. I mean, that's always a big aspect of any curriculum program or learning management system.
Not with Mobius. If I understand the question correctly, then the answer is no.
Oh, all right, that's easy enough.
Yeah, we have our security officer at the company who is, part of his role is to be up to date on all the different security protocols that are out there and are being asked for from some of our different clients, and then making sure that our product and our hosted solution meets with those. And
Yeah.
I think that's, in today's technology world, that's what we have to do. Like, that's what most companies have to do. You have to be able to know that the data that you're collecting and that you're reporting on is going to be protected.
Right. Well, now we've talked a lot about this period of time where we were shunted off to this grand experiment, kept the students connected. I mean, it's been, there are as many success stories as terrible stories about in terms of getting things together. Let's talk a little bit about looking towards the future. Joel, you talked about many innovations that you feel are going to stick around. Give us some more of those. I mean, give us some more where you see your work advancing in the short term and maybe in the long term, about where you see the potentials for this sort of dynamic to continue.
So right at the start of the pandemic, when it became obvious we were going to have to do all this preparation, I said to my colleagues, don't make this work for nothing. Don't do this work just for this year. And I think that at the latest count, next semester, when we're expecting everything to be allowed to go back to normal, 60% of my colleagues are planning some sort of hybrid. And I expect more will still include some of their videos. So I think where this is going is, I don't think we're going to get rid of in-person, because I think students don't just come to university to learn maths. They come to university and to enjoy those 3 years. And we're not going to take that away from them. It's really important. I really enjoyed my time at university as well. But I can see a lot more responsibility being put on the students for preparing for the sessions where they meet us. We've got a working group at the moment looking at hybrid principles. so that if a class decides that they want to go hybrid, there's a standard for them to either slot into or arrange or explain why they're doing something slightly different. Because there's a standard for traditional, so why not a standard for hybrid to help with expectations? And hybrid, I think some people, when they hear about what happens and what the students do, they might think, okay, so what that means is it's easier for you, it's easier for staff, you don't have to do as much. And I taught a fully flipped module, and it's no less work and it's no less time, but it feels like less work and it feels like less time, because instead of standing and presenting, you're actually interacting with the students. You're helping them to learn rather than just talking in a room that they're in. And I'm really hopeful that more flipped, more hybrid practices will come into practice.
Yeah, and I think too, Joel, I don't know if you found this through the pandemic, but I think there was this feeling that the students could reach out to instructors more. Like they felt that, oh, I can send an email. Whereas they may, in an in-person class, they may have been a little bit more hesitant to come to the instructor.
Yeah, I've certainly heard that conversation, that the dynamics of either one-to-one or small group going back and forth with the instructors, that in a lot of ways this Brady Bunch setup removes a lot of power dynamics that might otherwise be awkward if you're going to a professor's office or you're going to a sort of thing. And as you mentioned, Joel, too, the flexibility of just hopping on a Zoom call for 10 minutes, where before there might have been a 40-minute commute back and forth involved just for that 10 minutes. That those are all certainly techniques that that should stick around, right? So at least talk a little bit about where you see Mobius and where you see that these technologies, not only from your company, but in the industry in general, maybe the lessons learned of these past several months, where you see them progressing over the course of the next 3 to 5 years.
Yeah, like I said before, I think one of the biggest areas is just the idea of assessment. You know, the idea of an assignment or a quiz or an exam really hasn't changed much in the last, 100 years, right? Students sit down, answer questions, and but is that the right model for everything? There are times when that's going to be the right model, but there are going to be other times where you want to assess the student's knowledge in a different way. And through the pandemic, I think it's made people think about what do we mean by assessment, and what do we mean by traditional assessment, and formative and summative, and how do we progress from where we are now? And I think that we don't want to lose all the strides that we've made in the past year of thinking of different ways to assess students. We want to keep that as we move forward post-pandemic.
And I'd follow up that digital assessment platforms like Mobius support all assessment, not just the ones that run on the platforms. Because if I don't have to mark 300 linear algebra homeworks, I can do something else to support the students. I can give more detailed feedback for a richer assessment. So Mobius helps by freeing up the time as well.
Interesting. Let me ask you, Joel, what's your wish list when it comes to technologies that you might want to see in Mobius or other technologies? Have you dipped into any sort of any artificial intelligence, maybe some augmented reality that you can see for maths going forward that you want added to the docket?
I think most of my requests are a bit more technical, and the Mobius team already know most of them. So I won't repeat them here. One thing I probably would like is an R integration on the back end as well as Maple, because R is really standard now. I understand it's very difficult because it's not already served, but maybe that's my wish list. Yeah,
fair enough. And Louise, how about what you might have a wish list as well, or a hope going forward to seeing some technologies? Talk a little bit about AP after the pandemic. That's why I always like to end up the conversation.
Yeah, one of the aspects that I find really exciting, and I think as we move forward with sort of AI and machine learning is the idea of, would you be able to take a student's proof and grade that to a reasonable level? I don't know that a machine will ever fully be able to grade it, but even if you can provide, here's your proof, and the machine can say to the instructor, yeah, I think this is about this mark. The instructor can then sort of check that mark, but here's a default mark. That would probably be the one area that is still relatively open, just because solving a proof is one of those areas that does often require a human to see how the student got from one step to the next. It's not necessarily always a prescribed set of steps.
Let's talk a little bit more about where you see the ability to scale these things. And just in your work at the University of Liverpool, Joel, is that something where you might, we're talking about the hybrid, but is this also something that you see as a fully remote solution going forward as well?
I think a fully remote solution would be easy to design and easy to serve, but it wouldn't be an easy thing to encourage people to sign up for. That's my view. Going back to what I said before about the experience of university being more than just learning. If someone is just out to learn and they're extremely focused, then yeah, you can learn efficiently online. But university is more than that.
Great. And I know we're starting to get to the end of our hour here, and the toughest part would be to end this conversation. But maybe, Joel, you can talk a little bit about some tips or tricks for some of the audience members who are maybe just, I think everyone to some degree has initiated, they've had to, whether they like it or not, some sort of hybrid setup. But what are your recommendations for someone who is looking to, say, advance their hybrid mass program or their STEM programs in higher ed?
Keep the videos short and to the point. Include diagnostic quizzes after the videos, so students can get immediate feedback on whether they comprehended what they just watched. And I would say as well, split the low order assessment and higher order assessment up. Low order in the semester, high order after the semester, because that way the students keep pace during the semester, but then they've got time to think and reflect before they have to do the real applications. Right.
And Louise, from your experience, I'm sure you must have a few handy pieces of advice for someone who's examining this as an overall application for their department.
Yeah, I think the Mobius is a very powerful platform that can be used kind of across the university. It can be used beyond STEM. We focus on STEM because we have that math engine. And I think, schools that are interested in starting with Mobius, we have these content packs that they can take a look at, that they can use, they can start to customize for their own, they can pick pieces from different places. And we find that a lot of schools that are getting started, that's a big draw, because now they have control over the content. They can add their own pieces, but it can also be a progression that they take to get to their final product. It doesn't have to all be done right before the beginning of term. And I think that being able to make those modifications and make them available to students is very important for the students' learning progression as well. If you find a mistake or you find something that maybe students had some trouble with, you could create a video, you could create a lesson and post it up so that it's available for the next day for students. And I think being able to quickly adjust to the needs of your particular cohort really helps to improve the effectiveness of learning.
That's all really great stuff. And I think the audience appreciates those insights and ideas. But as we end up here at the top of the hour, anything that I missed? Any questions, any thoughts, any last words that you'd like to give to our audience before we end our session here?
Start small, aim big. Don't go too quickly into any platform, because Mobius is fantastic, but there were things we learned on the way.
Yeah, and I would say the same thing. Like, think about your course as a whole. What are the objectives that you want to really meet, and what are the best pieces to use to get to those objectives? And so again, start small. I know at the beginning of the pandemic, a lot of instructors just kept throwing more and more material up there because they were trying to provide material to students, but it wasn't necessarily well defined within the course. And so think about what your course is going to be. And, you know, like Joel said, start small, think about the individual pieces you want to add and build on it.
Okay, well, great. I see that our time is just about up, so I'm going to wrap things up at this point. If you submitted a question that we didn't get to in the Q&A portion, someone from Digital Ed will follow up with you directly. Louise, Joel, I'd like to really thank you today for an informative session with a lot of great ideas that I think the audience benefited from. And I'd like to thank the audience members as well for joining us and for adding in their own questions and thoughts. As a reminder, you'll get an email within the next few days that contains a link to this recording along with the slides. Thanks again for participating and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.